Canadian researcher is walking the Pacific Crest Trail in late summer when something on the slope above him makes him stop. 55 yards off the trail, a female grizzly is working a huckleberry field. She's pulling berries with that particular unhurried focus a well-fed bear has in August, when the whole mountain is food and there is nothing to do but eat and put on the fat that carries her through winter. He watches her for a while. He is not afraid. He has spent years around grizzlies and black bears both, in country where the difference matters, and he reads her on sight. The dished, concave face, the high shoulder hump packed with the muscle a grizzly uses to dig, the long front claws pale against the dark berry brush built for turning earth rather than climbing trees. He is certain of what he is looking at. He files a report later because he thinks it is an interesting observation, the kind of thing that might be useful to somebody someday. He has no idea what he has just done. That sighting becomes the last confirmed grizzly bear in the entire United States portion of the North Cascades. Not the last that summer, the last, full stop. In the nearly 3 decades since, across a landscape larger than the state of Vermont, no one has produced another confirmation solid enough to stand beside it. And here is the part that stays with you. For almost 30 years, the man who filed that report was a blank space in the record. Article after article described him only as a biologist. He was anonymous, a witness with no name, referenced constantly and identified never, until a newspaper reporter finally tracked him down in 2024 and told him he was the one. He was the last person to see a wild grizzly in these mountains, and he had spent decades not knowing it, having half forgotten he ever wrote the report at all. Think about what that means. The last person to see the animal did not know he was the last. There was no ceremony to it, no sense of an ending. Just a man on a trail, eating whatever he carried in his pack, watching a bear eat berries 55 yards away, with no idea that he was standing at the edge of something closing. That is how it actually ends, not with a gunshot echoing off a ridge, with an ordinary afternoon and a witness who would not understand what he had witnessed for another 28 years. So the question the whole story turns on is simple, and it does not go away no matter how you approach it. What happened to the rest of them? There is a filing system in the offices that manage this country, and inside it are the sighting reports. Every wildlife agency that oversees bear habitat keeps some version of it. People call in. A backpacker who saw something on a far ridge through the last light. A hunter who found a track pressed into the mud of a creek bank and knew, the way you know, that it was too wide and too deep and set the wrong claws to be the bear he was expecting. A homeowner on the edge of a small town who watched something cross the tree line at dusk that was simply too large, that moved with a roll in the shoulders a black bear does not have, that carried a hump on its back where a black bear carries nothing. Somebody takes that call, writes it down, and then does the quiet, unglamorous work of assigning it a place in a system built to separate what can be proven from what merely happened. The classes are precise. A Class 1 report is confirmed. It rests on physical evidence, a photograph with a geographically verifiable background, a track that can be measured and cast, hair snagged on bark that can be pulled and tested, scat that can be analyzed. A Class 2 report is high reliability, a credible observer describing something specific enough, consistent enough, detailed enough that it cannot be waved away, even without a specimen in hand. Below those two lie all the reports that never resolve into anything at all, the ones that stay exactly as uncertain as the moment they came in. Between 1859 and 2015, that system logged 178 credible, geo-referenced Grizzly observations inside the North Cascades recovery zone. Of those, 41 reached Class 1, confirmed beyond argument. Another 139 reached Class 2, high reliability, a century and a half of evidence, skulls and tracks and hair and sightings by people who knew what they were looking at. A century and a half of grizzly presence, narrowing and thinning and finally coming to rest on one woman eating huckleberries in 1996. The ranger who fields these calls now will tell you the phone still rings. It rings every single year. And a large part of the job is knowing how to take a caller's certainty apart without insulting the person holding it. Because people are certain. That is the thing you learn quickly in that chair. Certainty is cheap in bear country and the landscape manufactures it. A black bear standing on a slope with bad light behind it and nothing nearby for scale looks enormous. Looks like a different order of animal entirely. A cinnamon phase black bear, brown or nearly blonde, standing exactly where the observer's whole life told them a bear should be black, reads instantly as something rare and wrong. A big male black bear in the eastern hardwood country can push past 300 kilograms, and a bear that size crossing a yard at dusk does not look like the animal in the field guide. It looks like a story you will tell for the rest of your life. So some calls resolve as large black bears, some resolve as genuinely enormous black bears. And the ranger closes the file and thanks the caller, and the caller drives home unconvinced, sure to their bones that the official explanation is too small for what they saw. But that is the thing about the file drawer. Not every report closes, and it is not for lack of trying. This is the piece people miss when they hear that grizzlies vanished from the North Cascades. It was not a matter of nobody looking. Biologists spent years actively searching these mountains for grizzlies, methodically, with the tools of the trade. They ran hair snare stations, barbed wire, strung at bear height around a scent lure, designed to pull a tuft of hair from any bear that came to investigate. Hair that could then be tested to say, with certainty, what species had passed. They set remote cameras. They walked transects. They followed up on every credible report that came across the desk. Based on that evidence, thin as it was, the official population estimate in 1991 stood at somewhere between 10 and 20 bears. A tiny, scattered remnant, but a remnant. By the time the reintroduction planning was underway decades later, most wildlife biologists had moved to a colder phrase, functionally extinct. It means the animals, if any survive at all, are too few and too far apart to find one another, too sparse to breed, a population that has stopped functioning as a population even if a stray individual is still out there drawing breath. That is the strange, uneasy status the North Cascades grizzly has occupied for a generation. The animal has never been confirmed gone and has not been confirmed present either, and it lives in the gap between those two, where the searches come back empty and the phone keeps ringing, and the drawer keeps filling with reports that no hair snare and no camera ever managed to turn into a fact. Before you decide the open reports are nothing, you have to understand the size of the place they come out of. The North Cascades Recovery Zone is roughly 9,800 square miles on the US side, an area federal scientists formally drew in 1997 and called larger than the state of Massachusetts. 6.1 million acres of ridge and drainage and glaciated peak, most of it holding no camera, no researcher, no trail, and no reason on any given day for a single human being to be standing in it. This is not a park you drive through. It is a folded, vertical wilderness that swallows scale, where a valley you cannot see the bottom of sights behind a ridge you cannot see over. You could lose a great many things in that country. An animal that did not want to be found would not have to work very hard at it. A bear could spend a lifetime moving through those drainages and cross a human path perhaps never. And if it crossed one, it would be for a moment, at a distance, in the kind of light that makes every certainty negotiable. So when a report comes in and it does not resolve, when there is no hair on the branch and no scat under the tree and no matched frame from a second camera to lock the sighting down, the ranger is left holding exactly what the caller handed over: a description, a location, and behind both of them, a landscape very good at swallowing the evidence before anyone with a clipboard can get anywhere near it. The 2010 photograph is the one everyone in the region remembers. A hiker up in the Cascade River watershed near Marble Mount saw a bear on a hillside and got a picture on his cell phone. He was not sure what he had. Friends talked him into sending it to the Park Service, and a panel of bear experts looked at that image, at the hump and the posture and the proportions of the animal against the terrain, and they confirmed it: a grizzly. The first photographic confirmation of a living grizzly in the North Cascades in perhaps half a century. The research and advocacy community lit up. After years of searching that had turned up almost nothing, here was an actual photograph, an actual living bear standing on an actual hillside inside the recovery zone. It felt like the beginning of something. Then another photographer came forward. Same area. A bear, also with a prominent hump on its back. That was, on closer inspection, clearly a black bear. And once that second image was on the table, the certainty around the first came apart in everyone's hands, the way it so often does out there. The identification got walked back. Doubt crept in and then settled. What had been proof reverted to a question mark, and the North Cascades went back to being exactly what it had been since 1996, a place where grizzlies were once and might be still and cannot quite be shown. That is the entire problem, compressed into a single photograph. In this country, the animal that is easiest to imagine is the animal hardest to prove. Belief is abundant, evidence is not, and the gap between them is where the whole story lives. Work through the ordinary explanations one at a time, the way the ranger has to, because this is the discipline the job demands, and it is the discipline this story demands too. Misidentification, a large black bear seen badly. This explains most of the reports genuinely and completely, and anyone honest about the North Cascades has to start here. The cinnamon phase black bear, the trick of scale on an open slope, the shoulders of a big male hunched over a carcass, looking for a moment, humped. Raise it, because it is true, and it accounts for the overwhelming majority of what comes in. But it does not account for the trained observer, the wildlife researcher who has spent a career around both species and watched a female feed at 55 yards in good light. The panel of experts who looked at a photograph and confirmed a grizzly before a second image complicated it. Misidentification is a powerful explanation, and it is not a universal one. And the reports that survive it are the reports that matter. A wandering male from Canada. This one is real, and it happens, and it explains the occasional confirmed sign near the border. Remote cameras did capture grizzlies just north of the line in 2010 and 2012. A bear crosses. A bear is documented. But follow that bear and the explanation collapses, because a single male, however far he roams, cannot find anything. He is a visitor, not a population, and the females that would make him the start of something never make the trip. Hoax, error, wishful memory. Raise it and set it aside, because you cannot hoax a hair snare or fool a DNA test, and the sober class 1 confirmations, the tracks and the tested hair and the geo-reference photographs, were assembled by people whose entire professional purpose was to not be fooled. What is left when every ordinary explanation has been raised and given its due and found to cover most, but not all, is a residue. 139 high-reliability reports that did not resolve, a country too large to search, and a species the record calls gone, in a place the record admits it cannot fully see. So the question in the title sharpens into something colder and more exact. If they were here and the record insists they are gone, then what took them out? Set aside the word predator. It points you in exactly the wrong direction. The grizzly in the North Cascades sat at the very top of its world. It had no natural enemy in that country. Nothing hunted it. Nothing on four legs made it afraid. It was the largest and most powerful animal in the ecosystem, and whatever emptied these mountains of grizzlies was not something bigger and hungrier moving through the timber. It was a ledger. Between 1826 and 1857, close to 3,800 grizzly hides shipped out of the fur trade forts in this region. Read that number slowly because it is the whole answer in a single figure. 31 years. 3,800 bears reduced to hides moving through a trading post, because in that era, every large mammal in the American West was walking merchandise, and the grizzly wore the most valuable coat of all. A hide was money. A dead bear was a transaction that had not been completed yet. Grizzlies cannot absorb a loss like that. This is the mechanism that matters more than any other, and it is worth being exact about it. The grizzly is one of the slowest reproducing land mammals on the entire continent. A female does not begin breeding until she is well into adulthood. When she does, she produces a small litter, 1 or 2 cubs, sometimes 3, and then she spends years raising them before she will breed again. Her whole reproductive life might yield a handful of surviving offspring. You cannot pull 3,800 animals out of a population built on arithmetic that's slow and expect it to refill behind you. The math does not bend that way. Every female killed was not one bear removed. It was every cub she would ever have raised, and every cub those cubs would have raised, an entire branching future erased with a single shot. The fur trade was not thinning the population. It was reaching forward in time and deleting the generations that had not happened yet. The numbers across the wider West tell the same story at a larger scale. Federal estimates put the western grizzly population near 50,000 in the 1800s. By 1930, fewer than 500 remained across the entire American West, from 50,000 to under 500 in the span of a few human lifetimes. The Fish and Wildlife Service, looking back, named the causes without softening any of them: direct killing, habitat destruction, habitat modification. People, the agency said flatly, killed them. The fur trade opened the wound, and the decades after it closed the case. The survivors of the hide era were poisoned, trapped, and shot through the early 1900s as homesteaders and foresters and railroaders arrived and made a collective decision about what a grizzly was. Not an animal to be left alone in its own country. A problem, a threat to livestock, to safety, to the project of turning wilderness into property. And a problem gets solved. The last grizzly anyone in these mountains admits to killing legally was shot by a prospector named Rocky Wilson in Fisher Basin in September of 1967, in country that today lies inside the boundaries of North Cascades National Park. A man with a rifle and a claim, and a bear that had the bad luck to still be alive that late in the story. After Wilson's bear, the record thins to almost nothing. A confirmed sign in the Thunder Creek drainage in 1991, the woman on the Huckleberry Slope in 1996, and then the long silence that has not broken since. The silence the phone calls keep trying and failing to fill. There does not need to be a monster in this story when the mechanism is a market and a rifle. And that, when you sit with it, is the genuinely unsettling part. The most frightening thing about what happened to the grizzlies of the North Cascades is not that it was mysterious. It is that it was so completely ordinary. No curse, no predator, no single dramatic event. Just economics applied patiently, one animal at a time, across 100 years, until the sum came out to zero, and nobody was quite sure which year the last one had died in. And now the paradox that makes the whole thing worse. The habitat never left. The North Cascades did not stop being grizzly country when the grizzlies stopped being there. Nothing was subtracted from the land itself. The huckleberry fields still ripen every August on the same slopes where that female was feeding in 1996. The salmon still push up the same rivers to spawn and die. The high meadows still green up in the short summer. The avalanche shoots still grow the lush forbs and roots that grizzlies dig for. The whole vast machine of food that fed bears in this range for thousands of years still runs, on schedule, every year feeding nothing. Biologists have modeled what this ecosystem could actually hold, and the estimate lands near 280 bears. The table is set for hundreds of grizzlies. Every chair is empty. If you dropped a single grizzly into the North Cascades tomorrow, it would feed itself without the slightest difficulty. It would find more food than it could use. It could live a full life there and never go hungry. But that is not the same as saying a population could rebuild there on its own. And the reason it is not the same is the coldest link in the entire chain. Grizzlies can recolonize empty ground. This is documented, established, real. When a healthy source population sits close enough to a vacancy, bears disperse into the empty country, find one another, breed, and slowly the range fills back in. It happened with grey wolves that pushed out of protected populations in Minnesota into Wisconsin and eventually the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. It happens whenever the gap between where the animals are and where they are not stays short enough that a wandering animal can still find a mate at the far end of the walk. But grizzly biology narrows that gap to almost nothing, and the reason is a single fact about how the sexes move. Male grizzlies disperse. Young males strike out, sometimes across astonishing distances, looking for territory of their own, pushing into country where no bear currently lives. Females almost never do. A female grizzly stays close to the ground where her mother raised her. She establishes her home range near her mother's, in the country she learned as a cub, and she does not launch herself across unknown, hostile territory, looking for somewhere new. It is one of the most consistent patterns in the animal's behavior. Follow that fact to its conclusion, and it becomes brutal. Even if a solitary male grizzly walked into the North Cascades tomorrow, wandered down out of the mountains of southern British Columbia, or crossed somehow from the small, isolated population that survives in the Selkirks in Washington's far northeast corner, no female would follow him. He would arrive in all that empty, food-rich country. He would establish himself, and he would wait, and nothing would come, because the females that might have joined him are, by their own unbreakable biology, staying exactly where their mothers raised them, hundreds of miles away. One bear is not a recovery. One bear is a dead end with a heartbeat, and the geography makes even that lonely crossing nearly impossible. The nearest grizzlies to the North Cascades are few, scattered, and boxed in by the same forces that emptied the range in the first place. In Washington itself, the only grizzlies the state will confirm lie far to the east, in the Selkirk Mountains near the Canadian border, occasionally documented in the northern reaches of Stevens and Pend-Oreille counties. Even those bears are described by the state's own wildlife agency in the language of fragility: very small, isolated, cut off by habitat fragmentation and by human settlement and by highways, vulnerable to inbreeding and wildfire and illegal killing precisely because there are so few of them holding on in so small a space. That is the source population, such as it is. A handful of bears in the far corner of the state, themselves barely hanging on, separated from the North Cascades by the entire width of the settled Columbia country. Between those survivors and these vacant mountains lies exactly the kind of terrain that stopped working for large carnivores a long time ago. Highways with traffic running day and night, towns and railways and orchards and cleared farmland where continuous forest used to stand. A landscape broken into pieces too small and too exposed for a big animal to cross without being seen, reported, or shot. A grizzly attempting that journey is not walking through wilderness. It is walking through a slow-motion trap, past every road and every rifle and every fragment of cleared ground between here and the nearest other bear, and the same arithmetic that emptied these mountains the first time, small numbers, high mortality, no mates, reasserts itself and closes the door before a single dispersing animal could ever complete the crossing. The food is here. The corridor is closed. Those two facts, sitting side by side, are the reason the land could not heal itself no matter how many centuries you gave it. And they are the reason that in 2024, the federal government decided to do the one thing the country could not do on its own. The paper trail behind that decision runs longer than most people realize, and it is worth walking because every date in it is a public record. Grizzlies were listed as threatened in the lower 48 states under the Endangered Species Act in 1975. Washington listed the animal as a state endangered species in 1980. A national grizzly bear recovery plan was approved in 1982, and in 1997, federal scientists formally designated the North Cascades as one of 6 grizzly recovery ecosystems in the country, drawing that 9,565 square mile recovery zone with the national park at its heart, on the finding that this landscape could support a substantial grizzly population if one could ever be re-established. Then, for decades, almost nothing happened. The formal planning to actually restore bears began in 2014, when the Park Service and Fish and Wildlife Service started drafting an environmental impact statement. In 2020, that process was abruptly cancelled, halted amid opposition from ranchers, farmers, and rural residents who did not want an apex predator returned to country their families had worked for generations. Conservation groups sued in response. The process eventually restarted. Draft plans went back out for public comment and drew responses by the tens of thousands, more than 159,000 comments in one earlier round, overwhelmingly in favor of bringing the animal back. The opposition was not irrational, and it was not fringe. It came from people who run cattle on and near public land, who live at the edge of the wilderness, who understand better than any city commenter what it means to share a valley with a bear that can weigh a quarter ton. Their fear was for livestock, for property, for the safety of children who play in yards that back onto timber. And the whole design of the final plan, its most contested feature, is an answer aimed squarely at that fear. Against all of that stood another set of voices with a far older claim to the country. The Upper Skagit tribe and other indigenous nations of the region backed the return of the grizzly, framing it not as the introduction of a hazard, but as the restoration of a missing piece of a whole and healthy ecosystem, a being that belonged in this landscape long before any fort or ledger or highway, and whose absence was itself the wound. When the decision came, a tribal policy representative urged the agencies to move forward and, in his words, put paws on the ground so the recovery could begin. And in April of 2024, the decision was finalized. Grizzly bears will be actively restored to the North Cascades. Sit with what that document actually is, because it contains the real answer the title has been circling. It is a plan to bring grizzlies back, and in order to justify bringing them back, it must first certify, in careful federal language, that they are gone. It rests on the official finding that the animal is, in the words most biologists now use, functionally extinct in this ecosystem. The same paper that promises the grizzlies' return is the paper that confirms its absence. You do not write a restoration plan over a place that still has what you are restoring. Restoration is a word you only reach for when you are standing over something empty. The mechanics are as clinical as the finding. Under the plan, 3 to 7 grizzly bears will be captured elsewhere and released into the North Cascades each year for 5 to 10 years to build an initial founding population of about 25. The agencies project that population could reach 200 in 60 to 100 years if everything holds. The bears will be classed as a non-essential experimental population under Section 10J of the Endangered Species Act, a designation that gives managers and landowners more flexibility to deter or relocate individual animals, a compromise built to make rural communities willing to accept the return at all. And the individual bears will arrive the way freight arrives, each one selected somewhere its mother taught it a completely different set of ridges, captured in a culvert trap, a steel tube on a trailer, driven to a staging area, sedated, carried into remote release sites far from roads, fitted with a GPS collar that reports its position on a 2-day delay, so that even the humans who brought it will always be looking at where the bear was, never quite at where the bear is. That is the answer the title promised, stated plainly. What has been killing the grizzly bears of the North Cascades was never a predator and never a mystery. It was a market, a rifle, the slowest reproductive rate of any large mammal on the continent, and 3,000 square miles of geography that closed the door behind them and would not let them back through. We did it. Patiently, legally, one hide at a time, and then we waited almost 30 years and decided to undo it, one sedated bear at a time, in the back of a trailer. Consider the physical remains this whole story actually rests on, because they are almost nothing. A skull, a handful of tracks cast in plaster over the decades, tufts of hair pulled from barbed wire, a few photographs, one of them contested into uselessness, set against 150 years and 10,000 square miles. That is the entire tangible archive of an animal that shaped this ecosystem for millennia. The rest is testimony, and testimony was the one thing the discipline was slowest to trust. That is the quiet violence in how these populations end. Not only are the animals killed, but the evidence of them is consumed along with them. A bear shot for its hide leaves the country as a bale of fur, its bones scattered or rotted or never recovered. A bear that dies of old age in a drainage no human walks is reclaimed by the forest inside a season, the skeleton pulled apart by scavengers, the skull sinking into moss, gone before it can ever become a fact in a drawer. The landscape is very good at swallowing its own dead. What survives to be catalogued is the exception, the freak of preservation, the one skull in 10,000 that happened to lie where someone would eventually find it. The last confirmed native grizzly in these mountains was a female eating berries on a slope in 1996, watched by a man who did not know he was watching the end. The next grizzly in these mountains will come in through the door of a culvert trap, collared and catalogued, its coordinates arriving 2 days late. The thread that ran unbroken through this country for thousands of years was cut. What comes next will be spliced onto the frayed end, carefully, deliberately, but spliced, not continued. There is one more number in that plan worth sitting with because it reframes everything. The agencies expect the founding animals to grow into a population of 200 bears in 60 to 100 years. Not years, 6 to 10 decades, a century at the outer edge. Nobody involved in signing that decision will live to see it finished. The biologist who releases the first collared bear will be long retired, likely long gone, before the population the plan describes actually exists. The ranger taking sighting calls today will not be at that desk when the recovery zone finally holds the 280 bears the habitat could feed. This is a promise written across a timescale longer than a human working life, longer than most human lives, because that is simply how long it takes to rebuild what a rifle and a market tore down in a few decades. That asymmetry is the whole tragedy in miniature. It took perhaps 30 years of fur trade to gut the population, and a few decades more of poison and traps to finish it. It will take 100 years if all goes well, if the politics hold and the bears breed and the corridor stays managed, to put back a fraction of what was lost. Destruction is fast. Restoration is generational. You can empty a mountain range in a lifetime. You cannot fill it back up in one. And that is assuming the plan even proceeds. It has been cancelled once already. It has no firm start date even now. The traps have not rolled, which returns us to the strangest feature of this entire moment. The record of what walks the North Cascades is not written in real time. That is the loose thread the whole clean story hangs on, and it will not quite lie flat. The record is written after the fact, when something is finally confirmed, or when it is finally admitted that it never will be. Between those two moments sits an enormous amount of country, and an enormous amount of silence, and 178 reports that someone over 150 years thought were worth writing down. The reintroduction has not actually put bears on the ground yet. The decision is finalized, the plan is signed, but as of now the culvert traps have not rolled and no collared bear has been released, which means every grizzly report coming out of those mountains right now is coming out of a place that officially, on paper, holds none. There is no reintroduced population yet to explain a sighting away with. There is only the empty record and the phone that keeps ringing anyway. The ranger still takes those calls. Somewhere up in the Cascade River watershed, or along a ridge below Glacier Peak, where that last confirmed bear was feeding in 1996, a hiker will call this season and describe something too big, moving with a roll in the shoulders, a hump riding its back, and the ranger will take the call and write it down and assign it a reliability class, and most likely, in time, resolve it into a large black bear on a bad slope, in poor light. Most likely. Because that is what the evidence again and again comes back as. The landscape manufactures certainty and rarely delivers proof. The reports resolve downward toward the ordinary, toward the explanation small enough to file and close. But not all of them. That is the number that will not leave you alone. 139 Class 2 reports. High reliability. Credible people describing something specific in a country vast enough and empty enough that no camera was ever going to be there to settle it. Reports that did not resolve into a black bear and did not resolve into anything else either. That simply sit in the drawer, still open, still exactly as uncertain as the day they came in. Tonight, somewhere east of the Skagit, wind moves across a ridge nobody has walked in weeks. The huckleberries are ripening on a slope with no camera on it and no reason for any human being to be standing there. The food is set out the way it has been set out every August for 10,000 years, in a country the record insists is empty, waiting for animals the record insists are gone. What walks that ridge, the record does not yet say. The 1996 report sits in its drawer, the last confirmed grizzly in the country, waiting almost 30 years now to be replaced by another. It has held its place a long time. It may hold it a while longer. The rest of those mountains keep their own.